Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. My name's Pete. I'm 38, a sales executive who travels a lot for work. I've been married to my wife Jenna for 10 years. We've had our ups and downs, like anyone, but overall, I thought we were solid. Then, I met Laura. And well, everything changed. I wasn't looking for an affair. That wasn't who I thought I was. Laura and I met during a conference. I'd noticed her before, but we officially crossed paths at one of the networking mixers. She wasn't just beautiful, she had this energy about her, like she was carrying the weight of the world but still managed to smile. I made a dumb joke about the cheap wine, and she laughed like she needed to. We got to talking, and before I knew it, hours had passed. She told me about her life in the suburbs, her 2 kids, and her husband, Mark. I could tell there was tension when she mentioned him. Her tone shifted. She said he was reliable, which sounded more like an insult than a compliment. I told her about Jenna, about how things had felt flat for a while, like we were just coexisting. It felt like she understood in a way Jenna never had. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't attracted to her, but I convinced myself it was just harmless conversation. We exchanged numbers under the pretense of staying connected for professional reasons. I should have stopped it there. But the truth is, I didn't want to. After that night, Laura and I started texting. It began innocently, links to articles about the conference topics, follow-ups about work. But those messages turned into late-night chats about everything. She told me how she felt stuck in her life, how Mark had become more of a roommate than a partner. I told her about my marriage to Jenna, how we barely spoke except to argue about mundane things like who forgot to unload the dishwasher. We bonded over how normal had started to feel suffocating. One night, she sent me a message that changed everything. It was close to midnight, and she wrote, "I wish I could just disappear for a while, you know? Just leave all of this behind." I replied without thinking, "If you ever do, let me know. Maybe I'll come with you." That was the turning point. We started imagining what it would be like to escape together, not seriously at first. It was a game, a way to blow off steam. But the more we talked, the less it felt like fantasy. Her words felt like lifelines during long empty nights in hotel rooms, and I guess mine did the same for her. Eventually, texting wasn't enough. I suggested meeting up for coffee, just to talk. She hesitated at first, but then I got a message, "Let's do it." We met at a quiet cafe a few towns over, somewhere neither of us would run into anyone we knew. When she walked in, I felt my chest tighten. She looked different, like she was free for the first time in years. We talked for hours, and I couldn't ignore how my heart raced every time she laughed. When we left, I leaned in for a hug, and it lingered longer than it should have. That hug was the moment it stopped being harmless. After that, it felt like we couldn't stop. We'd meet whenever we could, cafes, parks, even long drives to nowhere. She started lying to Mark about late-night yoga classes or weekend book clubs. I wasn't proud of the lies I told Jenna. Business trips that didn't exist or late meetings that ended hours earlier. The thrill was intoxicating. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a voice in my head whispering that this was going to end badly. I ignored it though. Laura was like gravity, pulling me into her orbit, and I didn't want to resist. Then she said it. "I've booked us a trip. Somewhere far away. Just you and me." When Laura suggested the trip, I froze for a moment. It wasn't like our usual meetups. This was real. Getting on a plane together meant leaving all our excuses behind. No late meetings or book clubs could cover for that. I should have said no. I should have reminded her, and myself, that we both had lives waiting for us. But instead I said, "Where are we going?" "Bali," she whispered, like it was some forbidden word. She had a sparkle in her eye, the kind you see when someone dares to dream beyond their limits. "Just for a week. I need this, Pete. Don't you?" Did I? The answer was yes, even though every part of me knew the risks. The idea of spending a week with her, away from all the pretending and sneaking around, was too tempting. Jenna had her book club retreat coming up, and Laura said Mark would assume she was visiting her sister. The timing was perfect, or as perfect as something this messy could be. The days leading up to the trip were a blur of logistics and half-hearted goodbyes. I told Jenna I'd be in Chicago for a client pitch and packed light, slipping a couple of casual shirts and some swim trunks into my carry-on. When the day came, Laura and I met at the airport like strangers, careful not to draw any attention. My heart was pounding as we boarded the plane. I still remember the way she looked when we landed in Bali, standing in the airport with a nervous smile. She seemed lighter, almost like she'd left her suburban life on the other side of the world. I felt it too, a strange mixture of guilt and freedom. The first few days were surreal. We stayed in a secluded villa with a private pool, surrounded by lush greenery and the kind of quiet you can only find in paradise. We spent our days exploring the island, beaches, temples, little cafes tucked into the hillsides. And our nights, those were ours alone. It felt like we'd stepped into a different life, one where the rules didn't apply. But even in paradise, reality has a way of creeping in. On the third night, as we were sitting by the pool under the stars, Laura's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and quickly turned it face down. I didn't think much of it until I noticed the tension in her jaw. "Everything okay?" I asked. "It's just Mark," she said, brushing it off. "He's checking in on the kids." I told him not to call too much, but her voice trailed off. I nodded, pretending it didn't bother me, but it did. Seeing her so easily lie to Mark felt like a mirror, showing me the kind of man I'd become. The next morning, I woke up early to get coffee in the hotel lobby. As I was scrolling through my emails, I noticed a text from an unknown number. It was short and to the point. "Don't touch her again." My chest tightened as I stared at the message. Who had sent it? Mark? Someone else? I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed, like every tourist in the cafe was watching me. When I got back to the villa, Laura was lounging by the pool. I showed her the text, and her face went pale. "Do you think it's Mark?" I asked, my voice low. She shook her head. "He doesn't know. He can't." "Then who?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and paced by the edge of the pool, her hands trembling. "Maybe it's a prank," she finally said, but even she didn't sound convinced. That message hung over the rest of our trip like a storm cloud. We tried to pretend it didn't matter, but I could tell it was eating at both of us. Laura started checking her phone more often, and I felt the weight of paranoia pressing down on me. One night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about Jenna back home, probably reading in bed or chatting with her friends. The guilt was suffocating. I rolled over and looked at Laura, her face peaceful in the dim light. What had we done? By the time we had 2 days left in Bali, the tension between us was impossible to ignore. What had started as a fantasy, the idea of an escape, of living without consequences, was starting to unravel. That text had left both of us shaken, even if neither of us wanted to admit it. Laura was quieter now, more distant. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd just smile and say she was fine, but I could see the cracks. She'd sit by the pool with her phone, scrolling through her messages or staring off into the distance. I wanted to ask her if she was second-guessing everything, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. One evening, as we were having dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the ocean, she finally opened up. "I can't stop thinking about the kids," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I set my fork down. "They're okay, right? Mark's got them." She nodded but didn't look up. "It's not that. It's, what if this blows up, Pete? What happens to them? What kind of mother does this?" I wanted to tell her everything would be fine, that we'd figure it out, but the words felt hollow. Instead, I reached across the table and took her hand. "We're here now. Let's just enjoy the time we have." She smiled weakly and squeezed my hand, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it. The next day, things got even stranger. While Laura was in the shower, I stepped out to grab coffee from the lobby cafe. I was halfway back to the villa when I noticed someone watching me, a man leaning against a scooter, wearing a ball cap and sunglasses. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, but his gaze lingered too long. I ignored him and kept walking, but my stomach was in knots. Back at the villa, I tried to brush it off, but my paranoia was in overdrive. What if Mark had hired someone? What if the text wasn't a bluff? When Laura came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, I told her what I'd seen. She laughed nervously. "Pete, you're being paranoid. It's just some guy." "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. That night, I noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. It had been on her finger for most of the trip, a reminder that we were both living double lives. But now it was gone. "Where's your ring?" I asked. She glanced at her hand like she'd just noticed. "Oh, I must have taken it off when I showered. Her voice sounded casual, but I caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe? Laura, I started, but she cut me off. Pete, don't. I don't want to talk about it. The next morning, I woke up to find her sitting by the pool with a cup of coffee. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept. I sat down beside her, the silence between us heavy. I'm scared, she admitted finally. Of what? Everything, she said, her voice breaking. What we've done. What we're doing. What's going to happen when we go home? I didn't have an answer for her. All I could do was put my arm around her and pull her close. Later that day, while Laura was napping, I went into town. I needed a break, some space to think. I wandered the streets aimlessly, but no matter where I went, the weight of what we'd done followed me. At one point, I found myself in a small bar, sipping a beer and staring at my phone. I had a dozen messages from Jenna, mostly routine stuff, updates on the dog, a reminder to call her parents about Christmas. I should have felt guilty, but all I felt was numb. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, I did something reckless. I asked the bartender where I could find some company. He smirked and gave me an address. When I got back to the villa that night, Laura didn't ask where I'd been. She seemed lost in her own world, staring out at the pool with a glass of wine in her hand. I thought about telling her, confessing, but what would have been the point? We were both already drowning in secrets. Pete, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Maybe this was a mistake. I didn't know what to say. She wasn't wrong. Laura's words hung in the air between us. Maybe this was a mistake. I wanted to argue, to tell her it wasn't, that what we had was real. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. The fantasy we'd built was starting to crumble, and neither of us knew how to put it back together. You don't mean that, I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. She looked at me with tired eyes. Don't I? Pete, look at us. We're hiding thousands of miles away, lying to the people who love us. What are we doing? I didn't have an answer. Instead, I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Maybe we got caught up in something, she continued. Something we shouldn't have started. Her words stung, but I could hear the truth in them. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Laura was beside me, but the space between us felt like a chasm. I wanted to reach out to her, to remind her of how we'd ended up here, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I replayed the last few months in my head, the texts, the stolen moments, the lies. It had all felt so thrilling at the time, like we were the only two people in the world who understood each other. But now, it felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse under the weight of reality. And then there was what I'd done earlier that day. The encounter with the escort was quick and meaningless, but the shame lingered. I'd crossed a line I never thought I would, and I hated myself for it. The next morning, Laura was distant. She avoided eye contact, her words clipped and cautious. We had one day left in Bali, but it felt like we were already worlds apart. While she stayed at the villa, I went out again, this time wandering aimlessly. I ended up at a small temple, surrounded by locals and tourists alike. I watched as people lit incense and whispered prayers, their faces calm and focused. For the first time in weeks, I felt a pang of clarity. What was I doing? Who had I become? I sat on the temple steps for what felt like hours, watching the world go by. When I finally returned to the villa, Laura was packing. I think we should take separate flights home, she said without looking up. What? It's better this way, she said, her voice flat. Cleaner. We barely spoke for the rest of the day. That night, we shared a tense dinner, the silence between us louder than the music playing in the background. I wanted to say something to fix things, but I didn't know how. When morning came, she was already gone. She left a note on the nightstand. Take care, Pete. That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just a simple goodbye. On the flight back home, I couldn't stop thinking about her. About us. About the mess we'd made. I'd always thought of myself as a good guy, someone who made mistakes but tried to do the right thing. But now, I wasn't so sure. When I landed, Jenna was waiting for me at the airport. She smiled and kissed my cheek, asking how my trip to Chicago went. I lied, like I always did. It was fine, I said. Just work. But as we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to unravel. When I got home, life resumed as if nothing had happened. Jenna greeted me warmly, our dog wagged its tail, and the kids, well, they were too busy playing video games to care much about my return. It was almost laughable how normal everything felt, considering the chaos that had consumed the past week. But the normalcy didn't last. The first sign came 2 days later. I was in the middle of a sales meeting when I noticed my phone buzzing repeatedly in my pocket. After the meeting, I glanced at the screen to find a series of texts from an unknown number. "You think you got away with it? You're playing a dangerous game. How's Jenna?" My heart dropped. Whoever had sent the warning text in Bali wasn't done. That night, over dinner, Jenna asked, "Everything okay? You've seemed distracted since you got back." I forced a smile. "Just tired." The trip was more draining than I expected. She nodded but didn't look convinced. I hated lying to her, but what choice did I have? Telling her the truth would destroy everything. The texts kept coming over the next few days. They didn't say much, just enough to keep me on edge. I tried to ignore them, but it felt like someone was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Then, things escalated. One evening, Jenna and I were sitting on the couch, watching TV, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "It's probably nothing," she said, showing me the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "Ask Pete about his trip." My stomach churned. "Probably some spam," I said quickly. "You know how those scammers are these days." Jenna stared at me for a moment, then shrugged and deleted the message. But I could tell she wasn't convinced. The next day I got another text. "Tell her or I will." Panic set in. I started wondering who could be behind this. Mark? Someone from Laura's life? Or maybe someone I didn't even know, a stranger who'd stumbled across our secret. I debated calling Laura, but I hadn't heard from her since she left Bali. The last thing I wanted was to reopen that door, especially if someone was already watching. Then came the confrontation I'd been dreading. It was late, and Jenna was in bed while I sat in the kitchen, nursing a drink and staring at my phone. The messages wouldn't stop, and I was unraveling. "Pete." Her voice startled me. I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "What's going on?" she asked. "You've been jumpy ever since you got back. And now these weird messages. I can't help but feel like something's off." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Pete," she said again, her voice firmer this time. "If there's something you're not telling me, now's the time." I thought about lying, coming up with some story to put her mind at ease. But before I could say anything, my phone buzzed again. Jenna's eyes flicked to it, and before I could stop her, she snatched it off the table. "Jenna, wait." Her face went pale as she read the latest message. "Tell her about Bali." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and anger. "Bali." For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the sound of the clock ticking. "What is this, Pete?" she demanded, holding up the phone. I tried to stammer out an explanation, but she cut me off. "Don't lie to me. Who's texting you? And what the hell were you doing in Bali?" I was trapped, and I knew it. The lies I'd been telling were finally catching up with me. "Jenna," I started, my voice shaking. "I can explain." Jenna's eyes burned into mine as I scrambled for something, anything, that could minimize the damage. But there was no explaining this away, and I knew it. My chest felt tight as I braced myself for the fallout. "I wasn't in Chicago," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her expression hardened. "Then where were you, Pete?" The air between us felt like it could shatter. I wanted to lie, to spin some story that would make this easier, but the truth had claws, and it wouldn't let me go. "I was in Bali," I admitted, the words feeling heavier than they should. "With who?" she asked, her tone sharp and demanding. I hesitated, but there was no use dragging it out. "A colleague," I said. "Laura." Jenna's face contorted with a mixture of confusion and anger. "Laura? Who the hell is Laura?" "A woman I met at a conference," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We got close. Too close. I'm so sorry, Jenna." Her hands trembled as she set my phone down on the counter. For a moment, I thought she might throw it at me. "So what?" she asked, her voice rising. "You had an affair? You lied to me, to your family, and went halfway around the world with some other woman." "It wasn't supposed to happen," I said weakly, hating how pathetic I sounded. "I never meant to hurt you." Jenna laughed bitterly. "You never meant to hurt me?" Are you kidding me, Pete? Do you even hear yourself? The argument escalated quickly. Jenna wanted details, how long it had been going on, if we'd slept together, if I loved Laura. I tried to answer her questions as honestly as I could, but every word felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. It was a mistake, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. I ended it, Jenna. It's over. But you didn't end it before Bali, did you? She snapped. You don't accidentally book a tropical vacation with someone, Pete. She was right. There was no excuse, no way to spin this that didn't make me the bad guy. Jenna finally stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. I sat at the table, staring at the empty glass in front of me. My mind was a whirlwind of regret, shame, and panic. But the worst was yet to come. The next day, I woke up to find that Jenna hadn't come to bed. Her side of the mattress was untouched, and the house was eerily quiet. I found her in the living room, still in her robe, scrolling through her phone. Jenna, I said softly. She looked up at me, her eyes cold. I hope Laura was worth it, Pete. Because this is over. What are you saying? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I'm saying I'm done, she said, standing up. I've put up with a lot over the years, but this is unforgivable. I wanted to argue, to beg her to give me another chance, but before I could, she added, and just so you know, I'm not keeping this quiet. Mark deserves to know what kind of woman he's married to. My stomach dropped. Jenna, please, I said. You don't have to do that. Let me talk to him. Oh, don't worry, she interrupted. I won't be the one telling him. Whoever's been texting, you can do that for me. She stormed upstairs, leaving me reeling. The consequences of my actions were starting to spiral, and there was no stopping them now. I sat on the couch, my head in my hands, trying to figure out my next move. Should I call Laura? Warn her? Or would that just make things worse? Then, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Tick-tock, Pete. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let me off the hook. And for the first time, I started to wonder if this would cost me more than just my marriage. The text haunted me all day. Tick-tock, Pete. It felt like a countdown to disaster, and the worst part was, I didn't even know who was behind it. I tried to focus on work, but my phone felt like a time bomb in my pocket. Every buzz made my pulse race. By the time I got home that evening, I was a wreck. Jenna wasn't there, and the house felt too quiet. She must have taken the kids somewhere, maybe to her parents. I didn't blame her. As I sat in the kitchen, staring at my phone, I made a decision. I had to call Laura. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was cautious, almost cold. Pete. It's me, I said, my throat dry. We need to talk. There was a long pause. I don't think that's a good idea. Laura, please, I said. Someone's been sending me texts. They know about us. They've been messaging Jenna too. Her sharp intake of breath told me she was just as scared as I was. What kind of texts? They're vague, but it's clear they know about Bali, I said. And they're threatening to tell Mark. Another pause. Pete, you can't call me like this, she whispered. If Mark sees my phone. I'm sorry, I said quickly. But we need to figure out who's behind this. It could be anyone, she said, her voice shaky. Mark? Someone from your life? God, Pete, what if it's someone we don't even know? That possibility hadn't occurred to me, and it sent a chill down my spine. We need to stay calm, I said, though I didn't feel calm at all. I'll handle it. How? She asked, her tone almost accusing. You can't even handle your own wife right now, can you? Her words stung, but she wasn't wrong. When the call ended, I felt more alone than ever. Laura was scared, Jenna was furious, and I was caught in the middle with no way out. And then, as if to twist the knife, another text came through. Your secret isn't safe, Pete. Neither is hers. The next morning, I decided to take action. I called Jenna's phone, but she didn't answer. I left a voicemail, asking her to come home so we could talk. When she didn't respond, I texted her, but the message stayed unread. I couldn't sit around waiting for the axe to fall, so I drove to Laura's neighborhood. I knew it was risky, but I needed answers. As I parked down the street from her house, I saw Mark in the driveway, playing with their kids. He looked happy, relaxed, completely unaware of the storm brewing. Guilt stabbed at me as I watched them. How had I let it get this far? Laura came outside a moment later, her smile fading when she saw me. She motioned for me to leave, but I stayed put, hoping she'd come over. Instead, she pulled out her phone. A few seconds later, mine buzzed. "Are you insane? Leave. Now." I was about to reply when another text came through, this one from the unknown number. "Bold move, Pete. Too bad you're not the only one watching." My blood ran cold. I looked around, scanning the street, but there was no sign of anyone. My heart pounded as I started the car and drove away. That night, I finally heard back from Jenna. She sent a single text, "We'll talk tomorrow. But don't expect me to stay." I knew what that meant. She was giving me one last chance to explain myself before she walked out for good. I stayed up late, trying to figure out what to say, but nothing felt like enough. How do you apologize for tearing your life apart? At around midnight, another text came through from the unknown number. "You're running out of time, Pete." Tick-tock. I threw my phone across the room. The next day, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Jenna. When she finally walked in, her face was calm but unreadable. She didn't sit down. "Well," she said. "Jenna, I'm sorry," I began. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But it's over. I swear to you it's over." Her expression didn't change. "Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just betray me, you betrayed our family." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, Jenna, don't let this destroy everything we've built." She stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "Pete, you destroyed it. Not me." As she walked out of the room, I realized there was no fixing this. My marriage was over, and the secrets I'd tried so hard to bury were about to surface in ways I couldn't control. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, my phone buzzed with one final message. "Game over, Pete." Jenna didn't come home that night. She packed a bag, grabbed the kids, and left without saying where she was going. I stared at the empty house, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. My chest felt hollow, but I couldn't bring myself to cry. I just sat there, my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the next blow. It came the next morning. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing non-stop. My group chat with colleagues was lighting up, full of messages I couldn't process fast enough. "Dude, what the hell? Is this real? You're gonna want to see this." Attached was a screenshot of an email, an anonymous message that had been sent to my boss, my coworkers, and apparently half of my LinkedIn contacts. It detailed everything: the affair, the trip to Bali, even hints about the escort I'd tried to forget. There was no name on the email, but it didn't need one. The damage was done. I rushed into the office, hoping to contain the situation, but the stairs told me it was already too late. My boss called me into his office and closed the door. "Pete, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. "This is a nightmare, for you and for us." I tried to explain, but he cut me off. "It doesn't matter if it's true or not. The perception alone is enough to destroy your credibility. We can't have this kind of distraction in the workplace." By the end of the meeting, I was officially on unpaid leave while they investigated the situation. Translation: they were buying time to figure out how to fire me without causing a lawsuit. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something strange: a small box sitting on the porch. It had no return address. I brought it inside and opened it cautiously. Inside was a stack of printed photos, all taken in Bali. They showed Laura and me at the villa, on the beach, at dinner. Some were innocent, but others, not so much. There was also a note, written in block letters: "It's time for Mark to know the truth." My hands trembled as I flipped through the photos. Someone had been following us, watching us. I thought back to the man by the scooter, the strange text messages. Whoever was behind this had been playing a long game, and now they were making their final move. I wanted to call Laura, to warn her, but I couldn't risk it. If Mark hadn't found out yet, I wasn't going to be the one to tip him off. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. That evening, Jenna came back to the house. She didn't bring the kids inside. Instead, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her expression cold and distant. "I spoke to a lawyer," she said, her voice steady. "I'm filing for divorce." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Jenna, please. Save it," she said, holding up a hand. "I'm not here to fight. I just wanted to tell you before the papers arrive. And you should know, Mark called me. My stomach dropped. What did he say? He knows everything, she said simply. And he's furious. Laura's at her sister's place. I think you should expect to hear from him soon. As Jenna stood to leave, I felt a surge of panic. Jenna, wait, I said. Please, can we at least talk about this? I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. She paused, looking at me with a mix of anger and pity. Pete, there's no making this right. You didn't just break my trust, you shattered it. And for what? A fling? A fantasy? Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but she was already walking out the door. Later that night, as I sat in the empty house, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from an unknown number. It was from Mark. The message was short. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Face to face. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. There was no telling how this meeting would go, but one thing was clear. The fallout was far from over. Mark's text loomed in my mind all night. I barely slept, imagining every possible scenario. Would he show up and punch me? Drag me to Laura's family to confront her too? Maybe he'd just lay into me with words. Honestly, I wasn't sure which option scared me more. By morning, I'd worked myself into a frenzy. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone like it held the answers. Around 10 a.m., it buzzed again. Meet me at the park near my house. Noon. I didn't bother replying. What could I say? Instead, I took a long shower, put on a clean shirt, and left. When I arrived at the park, Mark was already there, sitting on a bench with his arms crossed. He looked calm, too calm. It was unnerving. I approached cautiously, my hands shoved into my pockets to hide how much they were shaking. Mark, I said, nodding slightly. He didn't nod back. Sit. I obeyed, lowering myself onto the bench as far from him as possible without making it obvious. For a long moment, he just stared at me, his jaw tight. Finally, he spoke. How long? He asked. I knew what he meant, but I hesitated anyway. A few months, I admitted, my voice barely audible. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I trusted her, he said, more to himself than to me. I trusted you. His words hit harder than I expected. Mark, I'm sorry. Don't, he snapped, cutting me off. Don't sit here and tell me you're sorry. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. The anger I'd been expecting finally surfaced. He turned to face me fully, his eyes blazing. Do you have any idea what you've done to my family? To my kids? They've been asking why their mom isn't home, Pete. What am I supposed to tell them? I had no answer. You ruined everything, he continued, his voice rising. And for what? A fling? A week in Bali? Was it worth it? I wanted to say no, to tell him it hadn't been worth it, but the words stuck in my throat. Was it worth it? The truth was, I didn't know anymore. Mark stood abruptly, pacing in front of the bench. You know what the worst part is, he said, his voice trembling. I would have forgiven her. I would have tried to fix things, for the kids, if nothing else. But this? You? I can't even look at her now. The weight of his words settled heavily on my shoulders. I'd thought I was just hurting Jenna, but the ripple effects were so much bigger than I'd realized. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said weakly. He stopped pacing and glared at me. Didn't mean for this to happen? Are you serious? You planned it, Pete. You lied, you snuck around, you went halfway across the world with my wife. Don't act like this was some accident. He was right. Finally, Mark let out a bitter laugh and turned away from me. You know, I thought about hitting you, he said. I really did. But what's the point? It wouldn't fix anything. I stayed silent, unsure if I was relieved or disappointed. Mark started walking away but paused after a few steps. Stay away from my family, he said over his shoulder. If I hear you've reached out to Laura, if I so much as see your car near my house, I won't be so calm next time. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As he disappeared down the path, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, guilt, shame, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the realization that this wasn't just about me anymore. I sat on the bench for a long time, staring at the ground and wondering what came next. When I got home, Jenna was waiting for me. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. How did it go? She asked. About as well as you'd expect, I said, sinking into a chair. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good, she said. Maybe now you understand the mess you've made. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The fallout wasn't over, but the reckoning had begun. And I knew the worst was still ahead. I didn't expect to hear from Laura again, especially not so soon. After what Mark said, I figured she'd keep her distance. But a few days later, while I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store, my phone buzzed. It was her. Pete, we need to talk. I stared at the screen, torn. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her handle her side of the wreckage while I dealt with mine. But curiosity, and guilt, got the better of me. What's going on? I typed back. Her reply came almost instantly. Can you meet me? Just for a few minutes. We met in the parking lot of a quiet coffee shop. She looked different, tired, almost fragile. It was a sharp contrast to the vibrant woman I'd fallen for months ago. Mark moved out, she said, skipping the pleasantries. He took the kids to his parents' place. He won't even talk to me. I nodded, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry, I offered, though the words felt meaningless. She let out a bitter laugh. Sorry doesn't fix this, Pete. I don't know what to do. Her vulnerability stirred something in me, a mix of regret and responsibility. You'll figure it out, I said, though I didn't believe it myself. We sat in silence for a moment before she finally asked, Do you think it was worth it? I didn't know how to answer. It felt like it at the time, I admitted. But now, I don't know. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Neither do I. We didn't hug, didn't make any promises to keep in touch. When she walked back to her car, I didn't stop her. And for the first time, I wondered if this was the last time I'd ever see her. After meeting Laura, the weight of everything seemed to settle even deeper. Jenna still wasn't home. The kids weren't home. The house felt like a shell, familiar but hollow, stripped of the warmth it once had. I spent hours pacing, scrolling through old photos on my phone, and wondering how it all went so wrong. There were pictures of Jenna smiling on vacation, the kids with their arms wrapped around the dog, holiday mornings with everyone laughing. Now, it felt like I'd burned it all down with a single match. That evening, I got a text from Jenna. I need more time to think. Don't contact me unless it's about the kids. I typed and deleted a dozen responses before giving up. What could I say? That I was sorry? That I wanted to fix it? None of it would matter. Instead, I sat in the silence, staring at my reflection in the darkened window, and wondered if this was the life I'd chosen. Jenna's text left me numb. She wasn't just angry, she was done. The thought of her deciding to cut me out entirely terrified me. I wanted to call her, to beg her to give me a chance, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I spent the next few days going through the motions. Work was still on hold, and my phone had gone eerily quiet. The silence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt like the calm before the storm. On the third day, I finally broke down and called my brother, Eric. I hadn't told him about any of this, but I needed to talk to someone who wouldn't judge me too harshly. Pete, he said when he picked up. What's going on? You sound off. I hesitated, then blurted it out. I messed up, Eric. Big time. There was a long pause. Okay, he said carefully. What happened? I told him everything, the affair, Bali, Jenna leaving. I left out the messages and the box of photos, not ready to unpack that part yet. When I finished, Eric let out a low whistle. Wow, he said. That's a lot. Tell me about it, I muttered. You're not going to like this, he said, but maybe you need to let her go. Give her space to figure out what she wants. You trying to fix it might just push her further away. I don't want to lose her, I said, my voice cracking. You might not have a choice, he said bluntly. After the call, I sat on the couch, staring at nothing. Eric was right. I needed to let Jenna make her own decision. But waiting felt unbearable. Then my phone buzzed. For a split second, I hoped it was Jenna. Instead, it was another text from the unknown number. What's it like to lose everything, Pete? I threw the phone onto the couch, my frustration boiling over. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let me move on, not that I deserved to. I grabbed a drink and sank deeper into the couch, replaying the text in my mind. The truth was, I didn't know what it was like to lose everything, not yet. But I had a feeling I was about to find out. The text haunted me long after I read it. What's it like to lose everything, Pete? It wasn't just taunting, it felt personal, like whoever sent it knew me better than I wanted to believe. I picked up my phone and stared at the message, debating whether to respond. Ignoring it hadn't worked so far, but engaging felt like walking into a trap. Finally, I typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly, "Does it matter? You've already lost." I was done playing games. I scoured my memory, trying to piece together who could have done this. Was it someone from work? Mark? A friend of Jenna's? My mind kept circling back to Bali. Someone must have been watching us there. Suddenly, I remembered the man by the scooter. His lingering stare, the way he'd seemed out of place. Could it have been him? I searched through my phone for Laura's number and called her. She answered on the third ring, her voice hushed. "Pete, what are you doing? I told you not to call me. I need to ask you something," I said. "Do you remember that guy by the scooter in Bali? Do you think he could have been following us?" There was a long pause. "Pete, you're being paranoid. It could have been anyone. Then who's sending these texts? Who sent the photos?" Her silence told me everything. "Laura, if you know something." "I don't," she snapped, cutting me off. "But whoever it is, they're not just after you. They're after me too." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I heard real fear. When the call ended, I felt no closer to answers, only more unsettled. If Laura was scared, it meant this wasn't just about revenge. Someone wanted to destroy us both. That night, I locked every door and window in the house, even though I knew it wouldn't stop whoever was behind this. As I sat in the dimly lit living room, my phone buzzed again. "Tick-tock, Pete. It's almost over." The words sent a chill down my spine. Whoever this was, they were closing in. And I was running out of time to figure out what they wanted, or what they'd do next. At 8 p.m., I waited at the park, my nerves raw. The air was cold, and the shadows stretched long across the empty paths. Then I saw him, the man from the scooter, walking toward me with a faint, unsettling smile. "You're Pete," he said, his voice calm. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. He stopped a few feet away. "Just someone who doesn't like people getting away with what you've done. What do you want?" His smile vanished. "To make sure you lose what you took for granted." Before I could respond, he turned and walked off, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there frozen, realizing he wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot.